Hey everyone, it's Thorn, and in this video, I want to talk generally about books. As you know, in the last few weeks, I've been making videos in response to viewer questions and suggestions, and I've had several folks ask me here and on other platforms about book reviews, because if you followed me for any length of time, you know that I've gone through phases where I've done regular reviews. I did them on Pathos for a hot second. There was a period a couple of years ago on Instagram where I was doing book reviews pretty routinely. And years ago here on YouTube, I had a book review series. So I'm going to start by talking about why I really don't do a ton of book reviews anymore. And then I'm going to talk more generally about how I choose books for myself and kind of, I don't mean this the way it sounds, but like what I'm actually reading, just because I think that there's kind of this assumption that if we're visible as witches, we're known as being witches, and especially me, I post, I think, an awful lot about witch books. That must be all I read, and in fact, that is very far from the case. So I thought I would show you what I'm actually reading, as well as how I make choices when I'm like at the bookstore or wherever, making choices about what I'm going to read next. So first thing, I don't do reviews very much anymore. Actually, I really actively avoid doing reviews. And kind of the short version is because I am just too soft and sensitive for the internet. Is really what it is. So the difficulty of book reviews is that, you know, we live in a small world and it gets smaller, I think, courtesy of the internet, which means that when you write about a book, when you speak about a book and you do so in public, you are invariably more and more speaking about people who you know, you interact with, you might be in the same peer group, you might be colleagues, you might be friends. And this has become increasingly true as I write, as I publish books, as I travel, as I meet people. I have immediate contact with an awful lot of the people that you encounter like on the shelf when you go to your local bookstore. And that creates some problems, I think, kind of, even if we don't want to really talk about them explicitly, which I'm going to do here, okay? Lots of people say that this isn't a problem for them, but it is for me, and I feel like it actually is for most all of us. Sometimes I think when we insist it isn't a problem, maybe it's because maybe we're not as sensitive as we could be, or maybe we're in denial, I don't know. But book reviews sting, even if they aren't like scathing reviews. Like I've really gone out of my way to never say anything like really horrific about anybody on the internet. And in the instances where I've insulted somebody or said something negative, it's been unintentional. So making a review, I think we would like to think that we can separate like the art from the artist, but we just can't, I think, a lot of the time. And in other realms, we actively don't want to separate the art from the artist. So when we're writing reviews, I can write a review of a book written by a friend, but it is also in many ways a statement about that person, whether or not I mean for it to be. Which means that I'm in the position, I think we're all kind of in the position of making statements inadvertently about our friends and peers and colleagues. And I'm no longer willing to do that. It creates a space where I think everyone sort of loses, because even like I could write something glowing, which might be dishonest. So in that sense, if people are reading my reviews and they're looking at my channel or my platforms or whatever for recommendations, and I feel like I can't say honest things or be critical about a text, like that completely, like that goes against the point of reviews. On the other hand, if I say something, and again, I'm not talking about being insulting, but if I say something critical, if I make comments about like, well, I wish this book had included this, or this book makes this argument, but then I feel like the author doesn't follow it up, you know, I have a problem with these folks who they're citing, etc. Like when I do that, like none of those things are scathing things, but they still sting, because as authors, like our books are personal. And I think all of us have really bad reviews of our books floating around there, and like we know we shouldn't read reviews, and many of us insist that we don't. All of the authors that I know are sneaking looks at their reviews, and they really sting. They really sting, and we know that they shouldn't, and we tell our therapists, and we journal into the night about like why this shouldn't bother us, and we pretend that we're above it all. But writing is a personal thing, and I have not found a space where I can speak honestly about the books that I engage with, to the benefit of readers who are looking to me for my opinions, versus like wanting to be supportive and like hype up my friends who write books or people who I just believe in and support, whether or not we're immediate friends. It's just messy. So I don't do it. And I think a lot of people aren't particularly honest in their book reviews for that reason. And I don't fault them for it, because it's a hard thing. Kind of the other portion of that, even aside from like writing about peers and friends, is every time I make a review of a book, whether it's a video, an Instagram post, or whatever, no matter what I say, my inbox fills with real angry people. Like, and it's just not worth it most of the time. I could write something that's very like middle of the road, and I get people who maybe are fans of that author or whatever, who act like I have like gone out of my way to like personally vandalize their property or something. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. So I don't do them. And as a reader, I really don't rely on reviews to pick my own books, kind of because I know how tricky reviewing can be. So yeah, that's why you're really not going to see a lot of book reviews from me moving forward. There you are. So if I'm not looking to reviews, how am I picking books? Just a couple of things, because I've made videos about this before, so you can kind of go back about evaluating books, making choices. But for me personally, I'm not saying that other folks need to do this, but this is how I make choices when I'm like in front of the metaphysical, new age, magical shelf making decisions. So one of the first things that I do is I ask myself, am I looking for like a research-based book? Am I trying to learn something objective, factual, historical about a particular thing, maybe a person or a period or a technique? Or am I looking to be inspired? Do I want something that's confessional, what folks online might call UPG? Am I looking for an individual practitioner to talk about their individual experiences and feelings so that it might trigger something in my own practice and my own feelings? I think one of the things that folks get confused about with those differences, it shows in the way that we talk about books, because if you get on YouTube or TikTok or wherever, people will say, oh, I really didn't like this book because it was all the author's like personal opinions and like they needed to do research. And the thing is, if you are writing about your personal experience, you don't necessarily need to do any research. If you're writing something that's akin to like memoir, which really isn't a term that we use in witchcraft like book spaces, but if you're writing about your personal practice, if you're writing about your tradition, or maybe it's a revealed text, if it's something that we have channeled texts in our communities. We have people who feel like they're in touch with deities or spirits, and they write about those experiences. And those don't necessarily require long hours in a library and like pages and pages of footnotes. And that's not why we should engage with those books. Like, there's a difference between reading about like a historical account of the witch's Sabbath, for example, versus somebody writing about how to like attend the witch's Sabbath magically. Like, those are different books. And it gets wonky if we criticize one type of book for not being the other type of book. So when I'm making a choice, I have to ask myself, like, do I want research? In which case, overwhelmingly, I shouldn't be in the metaphysical, magical, whatever section. I should make my way over to history or anthropology, sociology, or religion. Right? Or do I want to be inspired? In which case, maybe I want to hear about somebody's personal practice. So I start there. The second thing that I'm going to talk about, which is just kind of personal for me, everybody has their own things that are kind of like, think about it like the nope button. Like if I see this in a book, it's just like, nope, and it goes back on the shelf. For me, increasingly, and this is because of my background in religious studies, 100%, I really have like internal problems with the way we talk about religion and practice and witchcraft and magic as categories. And what I look for in a book is if an author is going to be engaging with those things, particularly like if they're purporting to engage with them at any depth, I need them to establish some definitions. And a lot of the time we don't do that. So here's an example. It has become increasingly popular in the last like 5 years, to say that witchcraft isn't a religion, it's a practice. And I'm not here to argue about that. Like, honestly, it doesn't matter to me personally, like how people want to categorize what they do. But if we are going to make a claim like that, it is important to then define religion and practice. Because if I say, well, witchcraft isn't a religion, well, then I'm leaving the reader to just guess at what I mean by religion. And if you look at that category broadly over the course of like centuries, that thing means really different things depending on where you are and who's writing, who's doing the talking, what groups are being represented, what groups are being excluded. So I don't need to agree with the author ever. In fact, I go out of my way to read books where I know I'm not going to agree. I want to be challenged. I want to be pushed out of like my way of thinking. But the only way to effectively do that is to tell the reader where we are starting, right? You can't make a statement like, well, witchcraft isn't folk magic without first talking about what folk magic is, right? Like that's a conversation that's happening right now, okay? And like that statement is, and probably is in many places, very true, but we can't back it up without first saying like what we mean by folk magic and what we mean by witchcraft. And overwhelmingly, we don't do that when we're talking about, well, witchcraft isn't a religion. Well, what is a religion? There are a lot of definitions out there. I need you to pick one if you're going to tell me that witchcraft isn't one. Okay. So that's a personal thing. You might have something else. I know lots of people who they put down the book immediately if it purports to be about witchcraft and it's very clearly, specifically Wiccan. Like we all have our thing. So my thing is, how does the author talk about religion? The last thing that I'll say, and again, I've said this in videos too, is if it is a research-based book, or if the book is if it's doing a lot of pointing to other texts, I flip to the back and I look at the works cited, the bibliography, and if they have recommended reading. And I look to see who they're recommending, who they're citing. And one of the things for me is a lot of the time it's men. It's overwhelmingly men. I think because witchcraft is so dominated by women. I think when you go out and you look in the world, if you go to an event, if like your local newspaper does a story about witches, right? If like Netflix wants to make some kind of sensationalist story about witches, the emphasis is practically always on women. But if you go to the bookshelf and you look at the books that we point to as authoritative, as the books that you should read, the books that stand the test of time, the books that are advanced, overwhelmingly we point to men, right? Gardner, Buckland, Chumley, Cochran, Howard, like you name it, right? Like we point to men. Books by men are often like at the fore. We have this idea that like, well, women write kind of like the stupid beginner books, but if you really want the advanced stuff, like here's this book that's really expensive book that you have to eBay, written by a dude. And you might be surprised if you've never looked, like how many books do that? Flip to the back, who are they citing? And we could say the same thing. And I mean, like this is even kind of more impossible, right? Like we could say the same thing. Are they only pointing to white people, right? Are they only pointing to like cisgender people operating in like heteronormative contexts? And like the answer to those things is likely yes also. So it's worth flipping to the back and seeing who that person is engaging with. That tells me a lot about what my experience of the book might be. So that's what I'm doing at the bookcase. Now, before this gets too long, because it's already too long, I'm going to show you what I am reading now. I'm not trying to go totally out of line here, because actually what I'm reading a lot lately is just kind of trashy horror novels. I've been kind of taking an intellectual break and reading lots of horror, which is my favorite genre. But here's the nonfiction I've been reading lately, just to give you some ideas of what I'm actually engaging with. So I just picked this one up. I haven't started it yet. I'm really pumped. It's She-Wolf, A Cultural History of Female Werewolves. This is an edited collection of academic papers. I'm super pumped about it because I've got a big werewolf thing. What else? I just picked up a copy of Stephanie Woodfield's Dedicant Devotee Priest, which I've started reading, and I'm pumped about this just because for me, my practice of witchcraft is about priesthood. And that's obviously that's not true of all witches, and probably not most witches at this point. But for me, that's a really important part of my experience as a witch. And I'm pumped about engaging with that in a really direct way. There aren't a ton of books out there, particularly in popular spaces, about priesthood and devotion. And that's something that's on my mind a lot and is really important to me. Recently I reread Making Magic by Randall Stiers. And this is kind of what I'm talking about in my earlier rant about what religion is, what magic is, what practice means. What Stiers does in this book is he's looking at definitions of religion and magic and kind of the relationship between them. How do they sort of play off of each other? How do we use one to define and think about the other across time? And he's looking at the development of the study of religion as a thing, and how magic and religion kind of come to be foils, where we think we know what magic is because we have very specific ideas about what religion is, and vice versa. And that's how we decide whether or not something goes into one box versus the others. And the thing that Stiers is pointing out, to which we should take heed as I scream it from the hill, is that those things are movable, and they're very heavily impacted by things people's religious affiliations, their agendas, the cultures that they're operating within. Those boxes move. So super interesting. If you want to know why I'm always screaming about what religion is and what magic is and what witchcraft is, this might be something to read. 6 Ways by Aidan Wachter, which is something I've read before. It's got lots of tabbies because I'm reading it with my Patreon book club. So the way I operate the Patreon book club, people are into it most of the time. It's real slow. We go a few chapters a month because I emphasize doing the exercises and then talking about doing the exercises. It's not super helpful, I think, to just read a book like this real fast, even though it's short and the chapters are really short. The effectiveness of a text like this, I think, depends on doing it and working through it. So that's on my plate right now. I'm also reading, I've been reading a lot of Josephine McCarthy lately, and I just got a copy of Tarot Skills for the 21st Century. And I'm reading this because I spend a lot of time with tarot. I've done some pretty extensive studying in tarot, under the care of a mentor. And I really appreciate how McCarthy is presenting something that's very different from the kind of assumed psychological, therapeutic model that we usually are operating in when we talk about tarot. Tarot is kind of this tool for understanding ourselves and the Fool's Journey and archetypes and blah, blah, blah. And Josephine McCarthy is very much about tarot as a divination tool, which is not to say that, obviously there's lots of overlap there, but there's kind of a pragmatism to McCarthy's approach that I don't think is very common in tarot spaces anymore. It was, I think, in the early 20th century, I guess, in the first few decades of the 20th century, as tarot became popular as a divination tool. But really in the last few decades, it's very much been well, this is a tool for personal development. And McCarthy is up to something different. So that's been really cool. So that's what I'm reading right now, on like interspersed with my trashy horror novels. So I hope you all are well, and I will see you next time.